Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Creative Challenge. This is week 3 of the Digital Product Challenge, which we've been running for the last little while. If you've missed the last couple of episodes, don't worry, they're up on YouTube. You can definitely go back and watch them. I would highly recommend you do. Today we're going to be looking at production and polish when it comes to digital products, which is sort of the third stage of our, the product challenge that we'll be looking at this week. So I'm going to jump straight in because we've got a little bit to cover today. Feel free to add in questions if you're still in the chat and following along. So as we've been looking at this whole project the last 3 weeks, it's been around, we've been focusing on sketching, testing and designing a new feature in an existing app. So just want to recap, make sure everyone's kind of on the same page. Last week, we looked at wireframes and prototypes, and the week before that, we looked at ideation and sketching. This week, as I mentioned, we're looking at production and polish. So we're really at that stage with a product where we've gone through different testing, we've gone through the process of thinking of the ideas, we've seen what's working, what's not working, and we sort of at this point where we feel like we're ready to go. We think we're feeling confident about the designs, we feel like they've been tested thoroughly, and we want to make them now, translate them from wireframes into something more polished. So, just to recap again, last week we looked at user flows, we looked at wireframes, and we looked at prototyping. So really crucial skills getting to this point for us being ready to put some, little bit of magic into the designs themselves. And again, just to recap, the goal that we're looking at is as a Wildcard user. Wildcard, of course, is the app that we're looking at the moment. I mentioned the last week. So they're a banking app. But the goal that we're looking at for this challenge is as a Wildcard user, I want to easily split a bill I've just paid for with friends so I'm not out of pocket. So that's really what we're focusing on. We want to make that easy and simple for users to do in the app. So today, I'll be covering a couple different things. The first one is UI libraries. I actually did an episode on that a couple of weeks ago in the live stream. So if you missed that, you can also check out that episode in particular. But I'll just be diving a little bit into that as well to start with. We'll be looking at assets and crafting those. So anything that may not already be in a UI library, we're going to actually look at how to export them and hand them over. And the last part is sort of like the handoff process. So usually there's that point where your designs are ready, you want to put them into production with the development team. So what does that look like and how do we kind of make that as seamless as possible? All right, so I'm going to jump back into the wireframes that we had from last week. What I will quickly show you though, just before we get into that, because this is a big part of, the workflow. This is the UI library that it's a bit of an old one, but it's the one we've been using for Wildcard. I put this together for them. It's a fairly robust for what it is. We've got this light version here. They've also got a dark side to the app, so they've got sort of 2 different sides. It's got all pretty much the basic components in there. So that'll be used as the basis for the next stage that we're going from wireframes into polish. So just to quickly show you, I've already got it loaded, but if you're looking to load a UI library, you can just use this as an XD file, and you would save it into the cloud. But what I would do is I would start a new document in XD, just here, and then I would go over to this side here where it says link assets. And what I can do is click on that, and then I've got this one, I've got a couple of random files in here, but in here I've got Lookbook UI library. Wildcard UI library. So I would load that in, and it would all be linked here. So I've got all my colors, I've got all my character styles, and I've got all my assets. So I'll just get rid of this because I don't need it, and I will go back to this file. So this is pretty much where we landed last week with all the wireframes. I've added a couple of extra screens in here on just based off what we learnt. So where we got to end of last week was that we had a prototype and we had some wireframes, and we wanted to go out and test that with people and see how they responded. And when I went out and tested with these people, generally it was actually pretty good, which surprised me because usually I'm very open to people telling me that it's really wrong, and usually they would be quite quick I'd change those things. But for the most part, it flowed really well. There was a couple of things I wanted to change as we went through, so I've kind of made some tweaks. But generally speaking, what we can now do from here is to start to apply the visual style to these wireframes. If you got feedback from, I guess, users that this was maybe not quite working and there were some real issues, you might potentially jump back one step, which is back into wireframes, and adjust those wireframes to match their feedback. Or if it's really not great feedback, you might jump 2 steps back and actually go back to ideation stage. So really it's about just figuring out how to move forward and using user feedback to really inform how you're going to design this. Right, so I've quickly added in this notification screen. This is kind of still leading towards a prototype, but essentially what was in the flow of what we had from last week. So we started with a notification. What we want to actually do is craft this enough so that we can now export the files to hand over to developers. So what I'm going to do here is, when I did this initially, it was all quite loose and basic. Like, I was using the font from the Wildcard UI library, but the elements were quite basic. But the good thing about the library in this case is that I can now start to just replace those elements with the actual elements that already exist. So things like my back button up here, I can now put in replace it here. I'm also using my trackpad, which I generally would not use, so I'm going a bit slowly. I might go in and double check the alignment of that, but just for the purpose of today, I'm just putting these in the rough spots. But I generally would also just make sure that that aligned to the grid that we're using. With these character styles up here, I think I've just I can't remember if I put this as a random style, so I'm going to make sure that it actually lands in one of these character styles, which is an existing one. So I'm going to hit balance. That looks pretty close. I think that was actually the same size, but it just had the color change to it. I'm going to just change this to, it's roughly that size. I'm not too fussed about whether they're like kind of named the right way. I think it's more about just getting them to be the right size. So that was the page title style. The good thing about this is, like, these character styles, they're usually the basis of things, but I can go in and now edit that to be a lighter version because I think I want that to sit down a bit more. So the primary element here is the cafe name, but I want to put that down in terms of the hierarchy, the timestamp and the location. So this one is just a little button that we've got here, and I'm just going to update that to, I don't have that as a component on the side here just because it was a newer element. So I'm going to just update that to more, I guess, what it is at the moment. So I'm just going to use my wildcard purple up here, and I'm going to just change the opacity to, I think it's about 20%. And I'm going to change the fill to also be that color there, and I'm going to make this medium. So this is actually, as you can see, it's really about going through and just like actually updating these all with the correct kind of, ratios and the correct kind of components, just to make sure everything is consistent. So like, I'm going to run through this quite quickly, but really this process might take a day or two just to really craft and get the details right. What's handy about having the library here already is that I can, for a lot of these cases, just drag and drop things in. So I'm just going to look for my button, which is a secondary button, which I think is somewhere that I cannot find currently. Bear with me. Here we go. Here's the primary button. So I'm going to need that one. Oops, that's an old one. Primary button seems to have disappeared from the side, or I'm not just looking at it. All right, I'm going to quickly move on to a couple of other things while my brain tries to find that particular button. Oh, I did actually have this expense button already saved, so there we go. I could have just added that in, so that's quite handy. Let me just find this. So there's a disabled one. We've got the small buttons. We've got these dark ones. All right. They don't seem to be in there for whatever reason. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this primary button here and just make this a secondary button. So I'm going to do that by taking out the fill, and I'm going to make the border our wildcard purple at the top here. The funny thing about this is you're probably all watching this from home and you can see exactly where those buttons are, but I just cannot because I'm blind and have a microphone in front of me. So anyway, I'm just going to update this to be, again, that wildcard purple at the top here, which I'm just using a color drop at the moment because it was a bit easier, because sometimes it can't distinguish between the border and the fill. I'm just going to make that medium just to make it a little bit bolder. So that's that screen done. It's pretty simple for that one. Now when I get into this, I also want to change this text style and make it, I think it's sort of around this medium style here, which is good. And then I'm just going to make this bold, or medium, sorry, just to make it really obvious that people are splitting that. Now I should have a text field, search field. Oh, that's an old one, sorry. So this is one of our fields here. So this is a style that exists already. Now this is a search, I guess, at the moment, so it's sort of in the same vein. So I can reuse this element here. I'm going to remove the label, and I'm just going to replace this up here and just mask at the top. So you can see it was actually pretty close, but like at the time when I was making this, I was not doing it particularly, I was doing it particularly fast, so it wasn't particularly with a lot of care for those sorts of smaller details, but the smaller details are kind of what we want to be looking at this point. Same with this, I just made this icon very fast, but I don't actually have a search icon, so I think I'm going to have to go ahead and make one for this, and that's not a particularly hard thing to do. I might actually start to get into, crafting this a bit more and making sure like this, I didn't really like the angle it was on before, so I'm just going to kind of adapt a little bit. I think, I'm probably happy with that. I might bump this up to 2 point here just to make it a little bit bolder. I'll see what the proportions are. Actually, I've made this is a symbol from before, so I'm just going to unlink that. Just grab it out. All right, so we've got our new search one here. I'm just going to group it. Don't quite like these, so I'm just going to make this 24, and I will just move this in here. All right, and then I'm just going to add this to my library over the side here, which I'll sort of use at a later date, but that's going to be handy for me to have, so I'll just put the search here. So I think sometimes you'll come in to a team and you'll have all these components and all these icons ready to use, but maybe when you're doing a new kind of feature within this sort of process, you actually don't have those available. So it's good to then make them as you go, but sort of keep in mind that you'll need to align that to some of the other icons that you've got in there. So keeping them consistent is going to be really important. I've got here another type style, so I'm just going to find, I think that's sort of more of a label style that I want to have here, because it's not actually meant to be too prominent. Just make sure that's aligned, and then I'm going to make it quite a secondary color as well. So I'm really just trying to find the balance of like what I think is working the best in terms of the layout of this, and it's also quite a clean kind of layout, and I don't want to go too hard on, I guess, over embellishing things either. I've also got in my components here, I've just put some avatars in just to make it really easy for me to drop these in and make it a bit more realistic as well. So I'm just going to align these in there quite quickly. Make this Natalie girl. Thing can stay the same because why not? And I've also got an add button here, which I'm just going to grab. Now that's a bit bigger than what I would actually need it to be, because I think the previous use of this add button was for a different sort of size. These are at 62 by 62, so I'm just going to bring that down to the same size to match. I might also think about whether or not I need to change the weight of that stroke as well, and maybe I need to have a different icon for just this particular use case. But in this instance, I'm just because of time, I'm just going to keep things quite quick. I'm going to align these just to make sure they're okay. And I'm also going to just apply another type style to these. And I think I'm going to make it just the smallest type style that we've got here, which is this one here. All right, I'll just line these up. And I will see if I can replace this with my, here we go. I can use this, I don't know why I didn't use this before. Here we go, we've got all our buttons. There we go, we've got our primary button. So this one's pretty close. I think it was a little bit off in terms of the size. So now I'm using this component, it's quite consistent. It'll be consistent with the rest of the app. So I think this was next. That's good. I'm gonna just copy that across, add that here. I think this is where you can sort of start to pick up a bit of pace, particularly with these screens, which are quite similar. So again, I think I need to just replace this arrow with the correct one. But now I can essentially just, grab all these elements here and copy them onto this spot here. So it's getting quite quick now, which is quite easy. I've got another few little components I need to change here. I need to change this border, which I think I will make the sort of lights color from the palette, this one here. That's okay. I think I might actually make that even lighter just to make it really like quite a subtle thing. And I might just replace these avatars again, just to make sure it's feeling a bit realistic. I just sent that to the back using a quick shortcut, which is Command open bracket to the left. You can have a look at that up. Another new icon or like new element that's in this particular design is this little, I guess, check tick icon, and it's sort of meant to represent that you've actually selected that. So that's not in these at the moment. So it's another new element I'm going to have to make. So I'm just going to edit this one and I'll just do that. So that's pretty good to me. I think what I will also do is, actually, I'll do this before I do that. I will change the border just to have a round edge on that stroke, because as you can see from, that's the style that the rest of the UI library has for the strokes. So they have that rounded edge. So I just want to make sure that's consistent. So I've got that. And actually before I make a duplicate it, I'll just make it a new component over here. Oh, actually, sorry, it is a component that I've just updated, so it's all good. I'll just copy that across, and then I will change these to make sure they're the right text style. All right, so we're getting there with these. So it's starting to come together, and this isn't not a particularly complicated UI, and it's quite straightforward when you've got a UI library to work with. But I think when you're getting into sort of more custom elements in UI, I guess that isn't already there, you're going to have to be thinking about, you know, what exists already, what do I adapt, how does this fit back into the UI library that is already there, so that it does feel like consistent elements. And so it's good to sort of cross-reference that with the UI library that you're working with, just to make sure that's all quite consistent. One thing, so these are all quite the same, and I can just, again, I can copy across this so it's all in the same place. I won't go through just at the moment these bits. I'll jump ahead to a new one that I prepared earlier. But what I have got here is kind of this new, I guess, version of the button that didn't exist before. And the reason I've got this is because I think when we did the testing, what we found was that people sort of quickly tapped confirm and they quickly tapped yes again. And actually what they missed on this particular screen was that they could edit the amounts. And then they'd sort of come back and say, well, actually, I really wanted to edit that amount, but how do I go back? Have I already sent the request? So what this does is, I guess, build a bit of friction into the process by saying you actually have to make a really concerted effort to slide to actually send that request to people. It does stop you a little bit from just sort of going on autopilot and making that, I guess, action. So because it's a new element, I've just wireframed it in here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to just move this down here. So I've got it for reference. I'm going to copy across this button here. I'm going to just unlink it from the component. So I'm basically using the primary button as a template, but I'm unlinking it at the moment. I am going to copy that, and I'm actually just going to remove this text from it. Now I'm going to make this a border and just give it a fill, give it just a border, and that's all. And then I will copy this one again, and instead that will be a fill. And then I will just bring this down to here, and I will actually I think I might just make this consistent with everything else and make it that dark purple color so it doesn't sort of feel a little bit off. Now in this, I sort of need there to be like an action to tell people what to do and to make it really obvious that it's a sliding motion. So I can just go ahead and use this arrow, which is the same arrow that I've been using from the palette here. In fact, I'll just drag it over. So this is in our UI library. The nice thing about XDs is editing these components is super easy. So I'm not editing the master component, I'm just editing this particular instance of it. So I'm putting in that arrow. And then I've just got this little, direction on what the action is. So telling people to slide to request. I might just make that's the size of the body copy, but I think I don't need it to be that dark. I want it to be more of a guide. So I'm just going to change again the color to be a bit more secondary there. So I've got this new component. Just going to group this all together, and then I'm just going to add it into my library. So I've got that there. Let's call that slide button / slide to request. Cool. So I've got that. I'll just add these now into here. Now that's the kind of finished version of that button. So I should just be able to edit this one here. I can remove that text, bring this all the way up to the end, and also just make the arrow finish here. Now, it's sort of hard because this is quite a static version of the button when really this would happen in motion and in interaction. But what I'm trying to convey here, at least to people who are going to pick up this file, it goes from this to this. And then I would have that conversation with the developer to sort of say, this is the interaction I want. I might find a reference that already exists, like the old iPhones used to have the slide to open. I'm sure a lot of people still have those. So that's a good reference to use to explain how that interaction might work. And often I find that like when you do get into custom interactions that aren't just like pre-built ones, you do have to find a bit of reference or find a bit of like a way to explain what that is so that everyone's on the same page as to what you're trying to go for. So I'm going to just jump into, oops, not that one. I'm just going to open the file that is up on the assets. So I've gone ahead and I've filled all this out here. So it's pretty much the same. I've edited a few elements. I think in here, like I added a little circle just to make it really obvious you've selected that profile. But for the most part, it's pretty much just filling out the same elements just across each of the pages. What I did also add in here was this page where you've sent the request, but here you might get a little banner at the top that says, hey, this person's accepted the request that you split. And here, this is showing that person has already done that. So when you come back, you can check the transaction, check the information about it, and you can see that it's there. Something I've also done and added is this extra kind of element within the transaction list, which is a different type of transaction that tells me now that I've split this particular transaction with people. So I can see their profile pictures and I can see that there. Another thing I wanted to have in here was a little alert badge on the transaction list so that if that banner has come through and I haven't seen that someone has accepted that request, I might get a little alert here that says, hey, you should check your transaction list because, Kat's accepted your split request. So a lot of this is kind of just thinking about, how does this feature affect the rest of the experience and the rest of the UI, and are there other elements I need to change so that I'm making sure that's quite consistent across everything. So that's pretty much, I guess, the polishing side of things. So I'm feeling good about where this is at. In the wider, I guess, look of the app, I think this is quite a minimal screen, but I also don't need it to be particularly flashy. It's quite a basic function, which I want people to get right. It's quite, I guess when you get into finance products as well, like you can't go too over the top because people just need to, you're dealing with money, you're dealing with people have a bit of anxiety around that sort of stuff. So just making it simple and clear is really what I wanted to do. And it also fits with the sort of brand of Wildcard, which is generally like quite a minimal aesthetic. So I've got that ready to go. What I might do is I'll just jump back into this little overview kind of thing. So we've got our libraries here. We've kind of looked at doing that. I'll go back very quickly. Sorry about all the flashing. So just quickly on this, there's a couple of things I might need to do at this point now that this is ready. So what I want to look at is, I guess, some elements that we added to this library on the side. So things like the search, this little tick here, the slide to confirm custom button, which is not actually in that file, but we just looked at before. But particularly the icons, we'll need to export them because often they'll need to just get put into, unless they can be created with code, generally they'll be imported by the developers into the production files. So I'm just going to mark that for export, and then I'm going to just go up to File and I'll go to Export. I'll do Selected. Now in here, I'll just create a new folder called Assets. So this is selected. And at this point, you kind of want to have a think about what you're designing this for. So what is quite nice about the way XD exports is that you can kind of select the platforms already. So you can do it for iOS, and that will export everything at 1 to 2 to 3 times because that's the varying different device sizes will need to kind of span across that sort of stuff. I can select Android, and that will select it. That will export things into particular file formats for that. Or I can just go through here and select, I guess, different formats as well. It really depends on how your developer's working and what sort of platforms you're using. For icons, I tend to use SVGs or PDFs because they keep them as vector, and then within the code you can actually change things like colors and stuff like that. So a bit more of a versatile format rather than have things in PNG or on image sort of styles. So I would export that. I might just do it as an SVG and just export that. Now I'd go through and just anything else that's new and custom within these files, I would go back and export them. And then once I'm ready, I guess there's so many different ways that you could export these or hand these over to developers. You might have developers who are very proficient in XD or the files that you're using, and they'll just take it and they'll play with it and work with it that way. You might have ones who want it exported in a very particular way. But the tool that I generally use and is sort of fairly industry standard is called Zeppelin. So this integrates with XD pretty easily. I'll open it up and just show you. What is really cool about Zeppelin is that it basically takes any of these sort of files and it's almost like bridging the gap between design and development, because what it will do is give you a lot of the CSS attributes. It will give you a lot of the information about these kind of elements on the page so that the developers can look at these things and they will get a lot of the information already, and kind of does a lot of the tasks for them in terms of the styling. So that's really handy. And the way I would just put these into Zeppelin is I think I just would select all of these. I would go to export, and then if you've got Zeppelin installed and you've got XD installed, it's already going to be there. So you just go to export to Zeppelin, and it will take you to, you'll have a few options if you have multiple different projects, but I only have the Wildcard project in here. So I'm just going to say import, and it will import these all in here. So I can see they've all just been put into here, which is super handy, so that now the developers can go in and they can look at all these files. They can download assets from this. It's a really easy tool that makes that kind of bridging the gap part quite seamless. So I'm just going to go back to XD. So that's a lot of, I guess, what that looks like. So we've kind of covered the crafting of assets, and actually, I think I just really briefly touched on icons, but I think if you're really doing that properly, you probably need to look at that icon library as a set and just make sure they're all quite consistent in terms of the sizes, so that when you're adding a new one in, it's all good and it's part of that family. And the handoff, again, there's many ways to do it, but the way I would look at doing it is through something like Zeppelin. And it really does depend on kind of how your team works and what sort of software they're using and what sort of workflows they're using as well. They might be pretty analog. They might be using things like Jira, and you're putting files in there. You might be using Slack. Like, it really completely varies. So I think in this sense, it's being quite flexible about how you want to send those files. But the big thing I would stress as well is like the easiest way to hand over files is to sit down with someone and walk them through it, particularly developers or whoever's taking the file on. But if you're trying to translate that sort of, I guess, tell them, what you have in mind and just show them, it's so much easier if you're actually having that conversation with them one-on-one. They can question things, and often I've had really, really great chats with developers where they'll say, well, actually, there's a really quick and easy way to do this. There's already a native component for that. We can just do this and do that, and that's fine and sorted. But otherwise, I think I find that if you're just sending things off into the ether and you're hoping people will pick it up and understand what you're saying, it can lead to a lot of just like miscommunication. So I'd recommend doing that. The last thing, I guess, or almost last thing that I want to cover was this little checklist. So this is sort of a little checklist I would look at in terms of making sure my files are ready to go. So I would check that the designs are thoroughly tested. I would also check that they've passed accessibility guidelines. That's something I didn't touch on in this, because most of the stuff that I've designed already, I've kind of looked at making sure is accessible. But if it's a new feature, if you're unsure about sort of stuff, you want to check your type sizes are right, the contrast is right, that it's really easy to use for edge cases, all of those sorts of things. Microcopy is approved. Like, I think on certain things, like maybe I'm using the word request here, and I'm using things like slide to request and tap. All of those little bits of microcopy, someone might need to like look over, and it might be quicker and easier for someone to make a call on what those things are, or you may have got a wording right or wrong, that sort of stuff. I'll make sure the developers have reviewed everything. I don't want to just send something to a development team and it's like out of the blue and they had no idea what was happening. And you would have had those discussions along the way ideally, but I would just make sure that they've had a look over everything. I would make sure the designs are ready for all different types of platforms. So whether it's iOS, Android, or it's web, like I've been on teams that design for both. So I have to make sure that both of the designs I've got are compatible with all platforms. All those individual assets are exported. So anything that might be custom or needed for the development team, they have that ready to go. Designs are uploaded to Zeppelin, and also all the assets and designs that the new ones are merged back into the master files, because usually you'll have like a master file of all of the components and all of the designs to date, and if you're adding new ones to those, you'll need to make sure they're just merged back in. So that's kind of most of it. There is kind of this other element to things which maybe if we have time next week when we kind of do a recap and wrap up of everything, we can touch on briefly, and that's around like custom interactions and animations. If there's a really particular custom feature that you're working on that has a really unique animation or interaction to it, sometimes the easiest way to do it is to animate it yourself to kind of tell someone how to do it. Or you might be using something like there's a tool called Lottie, which was actually developed by the guys at Airbnb, and that is another way in which you can kind of use After Effects to then export files that can be put straight into like the web or app, and it's quite a seamless process. But didn't have quite enough time to talk about it today. If we do, I'll touch on it next week. But yeah, so that's basically production and polish. Hopefully that was all pretty clear. So that's all from us. Just to recap, what I chatted to you about today was UI libraries. So integrating them into, I guess, the workflow to make things quick and simple when you're polishing things up from your wireframes, exporting your assets and getting them ready to go, and then also the handoff. So how you kind of handing your files over and making it easy for a development team to pick that up and start building everything into production. So that's it for today. If you want to pick up the files that are in the, that we've uploaded, feel free to download them. Again, like we would love to talk about this next week if you want to upload your files and talk us through like what you've found and what you've tested, and maybe you've gone in a completely different direction. I mean, I'd love to see if that's the case. So we'll see you back here next week for part 4 of the Creative Challenge for digital products. And thanks for joining me.